Hey guys, so today I just wanted to go over some animation techniques. I'm going to start with a blank scene just so you can see me reference in my rig again. I'm going to switch over to animation real quick. It's not important for referencing, but I'm going to go in and I was just File, Create Reference. And you'll see it's going to bring up a file navigator for us, and so we need to find our rig. I'm deep into my Unity assets for this one, so I'm going to go find that, and I'm just going to reference this rig in. Remember, this referencing pipeline means that you can go in and alter the rig, and the next time you open the scene, it'll bring it in. Just remember, if you renamed any of these controls in between animating, and then the next time you bring in the character, then that is going to cause problems for you because the animation is no longer going to carry over. So as long as you keep these names the same up here, then you should be fine, like in your source rig file, that is. But I just want to go over some nice features of Rapid Rig and pretty much all rigs in general. So first thing is IK and FK. So IK and FK are different ways of moving your character around, and you can access the switch by clicking on this little arrow thing right here and then going to this tab, and I just switched it to 1. So 1, since it's IK, then FK, this is a value that's always 0 to 1, 0 being IK, 1 being FK, alright? Because it's a binary switch. Binary is always 0 and 1. So now we're in FK mode, and you'll notice on these controls I can't move them. Keep in mind when you're animating these characters that you should never animate the joints. So if I go in and let's see, turn on, don't animate these joints. That's going to mess up all of the connections with Rapid Rig or whatever. That goes for pretty much any rig that you create. You don't animate the joints directly. You only animate the controls. So we're in FK mode, and we can no longer move with these arrows. But if you go into rotate, you'll see that you can still rotate all these controls. The thing to keep in mind is that FK stands for forward kinematics. What that means is that it's evaluating the position. It's like figuring out the position of this last joint based on the rotations, all these other joints in the hierarchy. So we now, it basically starts at the base and then just goes forward down the hierarchy and is evaluating all those rotations to find out how this elbow and wrist bend. So that's FK. And this is really good for if you're walking. Say you're just walking and then I'd set a key right there. Boom, bang. Further down the walk cycle, key forward. Oh, see, alright, that's another thing. Alright, well, so that's FK. I'm going to go back to that because I want to show you a really nice feature first that I think everyone should animate with. Oh, and I just made a play blast. Classic. Don't need to see that. I'm going to delete this key. And I'm going to enable, so the reason that happened, why those keys didn't get placed, is because I didn't press S, right? And that's how the introduction to animation usually is. It's like, oh, you gotta press S to set a key. The thing is, in a normal pipeline, you do not use S to set keys. What you instead do is turn on auto keyframe. It's right down here. And I'm going to select that. And I'm going to switch this back to FK. Right there. And then I'm going to set my first key on all these controls. Boom. So now all those have been keyed. The only thing is, now I don't need to, I'm going to scroll further down the timeline to like frame 10. Then I'm going to set another key. or I'm not. I didn't press S for that. I'm just posing these out, and you'll notice that, you can say for this wrist, there's no key at frame 10, but if I rotate it, as soon as I rotate it, that key pops up. So it's automatically remembering where I'm posing these. Let me go back to this, and it's remembering that I'm setting, or it's just detecting that I'm changing the position of these controls and is setting keys for me. So now, if I go into my graph editor, animation editor, graph editor, you can see that it's automatically setting these keys for me. You'll see that it's moving the character around with those FK rotations. Now you saw that it was going super fast. So what you want to do, if you watch that other video of setting up your scene, you should be fine already. But if it's not fine like it is right now, I'm going to go to settings, settings and preferences, preferences, and here you find, I'm going to set this to meters just so it's easier to see the graph, the grid of the scene. And for your guys' time, you'll probably be doing 24 FPS because that's film. That's films frames per second. Games, you animate at 30 FPS because most of them are locked to 60 FPS, and you don't need 60 FPS fidelity unless you're working on a fighting game, something with like frame perfect inputs. Then you'd be animating at 60 FPS. You might be animating at a lower FPS too for stylistic purposes. Like I know a lot of anime is animated at 12 FPS, so that kind of gives it a more hand-drawn look, I guess. Same with that like Spider-Verse. There's a lot of FPS playing around with in that film as well. But I'm going to set it to 30 for me, but at home for your guys' film projects, you're going to be doing 24 probably. So I'm going to save that. And then if I press play again, it's going still pretty fast. And the reason is because you have, there's playback speed. It's playing every frame free. Free means it's not locked to any FPS. And it's just playing this animation as fast as my computer can render it. And my computer can render it faster than 30 FPS. So I'm going to switch that back to real time. And there you go. So that's what our animation looks like there. You'll also notice that this is set to 1.25. I'm just going to set that back to 1, just so it makes more sense. It doesn't make sense to start at, I'm going to start at frame 1.25. Like, who the hell does that? So we got this going now. And before, I got distracted with the auto key features. We were talking about IK versus FK. This is a very important concept. So we've been doing FK rotations and stuff for all these keys, right? I'm just going to delete them in my graph editor. Remember, you should always keep your graph editor open. You'll notice that there's no animation now. Oh, I didn't have my clavicle selected, so I should select that. And here we go. So now we lost all of our animation data. Now if I switch this to IK, remember it's 0 and 1 to switch between these. Let's see if does on and off work? Because on and off can sometimes work for this stuff. No, it doesn't look it. But you'll see now when I switch back, it goes to the default pose because this is a different control. This is the IK control for the arm, not the FK one, which is posed down here somewhere. But you change that with this little arrow. Same thing goes for these. Notice how your feet are IK starting off because it's 0. If you switch to 1, then you have all of these rotation controls, and on these controls you can see that they're super small. So I'm going to need to go in my rig source file, and with these controls selected, go to control vertex instead, and then select these, make sure you have all of them selected, and then scale that to a point where you can see it. That way it's easier to animate. You can just grab it around. But since I did that in the animation file, that's incorrect. I would need to open up the source reference, the rig file that I've referenced into the scene and do it there. Technically you could do it in this animation file, but it's just, I wouldn't want to spread like a bad workflow to you guys, and that's just a weird workflow. But yeah, so now that this is switched over to FK, you can see that it's evaluating like this, and you have to go down the joint or the control chain and pose all these around. IK, which we just switched this over to, you'll see replaces all of these just standard ring controls with one end control, and then one, this is usually called a pole vector, and I'll explain why. So with your hand control selected then, you'll notice that we don't only have rotate on this, we also have translate. So we can go into our W, our move tool, and kind of just pose this around. And it's super nice for posing purposes, because you can just straight up go in here and be like, I want this hand at this position at this time, and you'll be set. Now for back to that pole vector, this is usually a pole vector. It's called a pole vector because it's a vector is basically a three-dimensional direction, and by having it out here, you'll see that the elbow's direction that it's pointing is being directed towards that. So this is how you get those different poses for the elbow in here. You can kind of crank it as much as you can. Look at this, like the rig starts to break when you kind of push it past its limit. So you're going to want to go for naturalistic poses in your animation, you know. But yeah, so that's IK. And remember, for auto key to work, you have to set that first key at some point, and then you can drag down the timeline, set this to a different place, boom, bang, and then right there, you'll notice it made the keys. You can see them, you can verify them on our graph editor, and yeah, keying around. So a good practice is to keep your arms in FK normally, but for things like, because Grandma's going to have a shop table on in front of her, and if I'm going to be animating Grandma around, notice how that arm, or that leg that's in FK, is rotating with the rest of the character. But this hand and this other foot that are still in IK aren't. So if I want her hand resting on this table, it's a good idea to maybe start with IK on this, and get like a nice naturalistic pose. You'd have to go into all these finger joints and kind of play with those, because they're penetrating the table right now, but you need to kind of get around that. You might get into like a sort of knuckle pose. This. Let's just get that. This posing would probably take a little bit more time to get right, but well, this is fine for now. So you'll see that now, if I have this control set in this place in IK, and remember, I need to set a key on all those finger controls in order for it to remember. Normally I set up a script that can select all these controls at once because there's just a lot. You'll notice that this arm switch control also has a lot of different channels for this. So it has like thumb curl, and then you can left click and drag to select multiple channels, and then control left click to add to that selection. So if I get all the curls in here, and then middle click drag in the viewport, you see that it's affecting the curl of all of those values. But then I find that it's like, if you have keys on your fingers as well as this, it gets really confusing in terms of like what is driving your animation. But with this hand posed out in here, you can kind of move the rest of your character around, and it won't affect how that hand is placed on the table. If this was an FK, it would definitely affect it though. So that's it for IK versus FK and auto key. Those are some pretty basic kind of animation practices and tools that we use. I'm going to turn off joints just so I don't select them, because I don't want to see the joints in this view, because you're just risking setting a key on a joint, and that's going to really mess up your rig. But yeah, so when I'm starting a file, I usually select all the controls and then set a key on them. And you'll notice that I have an offset key right here. Like look, I'm at frame 1. And if I go to frame 2, I'm past that. Like in this timeline, I'm past these keys. So you can either go in here and drag select over those keys, and you'll see that they're at 0.125, and you can just set those to 1. Because remember, this graph editor has information for all of these, like this is all of your animation in the scene. Or you can, on this timeline, right click it and go to snap. But sometimes you'll see that doesn't work, since there's like, snap basically moves those keys over to align with frame 1 or frame, like whatever frame you're selected on in here. But the thing is we don't want that for like we've already set a key at frame 1 on our timeline. So if these keys are at frame 1.25, so now it's trying to move those to frame 1, but there's already keys on frame 1, so it's like, what am I gonna do? So yeah, if you run into any offset keys like that, that usually happens if you're kind of doing some interesting stuff in the graph editor. So for instance, if I have keys set at 21, 12, and then I have keys at 13. Let's see. Let me select all my controls again. I have a key set at 13. You can also, with having all of these selected, you can scale. And you can scale up like this, and you'll see Ground's getting really freaking whacked out of her mind, because it's just applying keys everywhere. But you can also kind of go in and you can scale out to the side as well. So it's going to scale your animation. But you'll see that you'll often get keys that don't align with anything. So you can see like this one's like in the middle of frame 16. That's not right. So you can go in here and snap. If there's no keys already on frame, wherever it's going to push it, in this case, it pushed it to frame 17. Or you can just go in here, drag select over them, and then be like, okay, this is going to be at frame 16 only. And there you go. So it snaps on there. So that's a little bit of graph editor stuff as well. But I want to show you guys before we head out here. I want to show you something called stepped preview. So in animation, you have kind of animating pose to pose or straight ahead. So animating straight ahead means that you start with one pose, and then you're like, okay, I know exactly where all these controls are going to go until I finish my animation. Pose to pose is you set up one key somewhere. You're like, okay, so I want grandma to be in this pose. Let's go set this to FK. Boom. I don't want any more keys controlling FK. I want this to be FK throughout. So you see how I just deleted all the other keys that were on this control, just so I could make sure that it was FK this whole time. So if I want her in a more relaxed pose, I'm going to bring down these shoulders so they're not as tense up. I'm probably going to have to adjust where that joint goes, because I think I put her joint a bit too far out on the elbow, or I mean on the shoulder, but that's fine for now. So you'd be like, I want her to start in this pose. So you'd get keys on all these FK controls. And then remember we set up this pose, so it's this hand, somewhere around, frame 12. And you'll see that it's all those keys are in there. So we want this entire arm's keys to be basically moved over to the first key. So I'm going to delete that first key in my graph editor. And I just drag selected with left click and then press delete on there in order to do that. And I'm going to move these over to frame 1. Now if I am just holding middle click, well, in order to move these in the first place, you can press W while you have them selected, and then middle click around, or hold middle click and drag. So now it's 1-to-1 with my mouse. You'll see that it is snapping to the specific keys, but that's not what we want exactly, because we want this key just to be all these same values on the graph, right? Because this one's at 70.127, 8.772, negative 50.49, negative 66.51. Like we want all those values just to be over here, and you can do that by selecting, and you can do Control C and then Control V in this as well. That works. You can also middle click drag, but if you hold Shift while you middle click and then you drag to the left, now if I go up and down, it's still only adjusting the left and right values. The same goes for if you're dragging up. So if you hold Shift while you're middle click dragging, you can no longer adjust the timing of that. But we would just want to adjust the timing of it, so we're just going to drag that over to the left. And there you go. So if we wanted this pose here, I don't know why her leg's up, but that's fine. Let's get her head kind of more looking at straight out at the player. Right there. Perfect. Oh god, this box has some wild colors on it. I'm going to assign a new material just so it's not weird looking. So she's looking out in this pose. So animating pose to pose, you'd want to see, you'd want to make sure all your controls are keyed on each of these frames, you know. So the next pose would be like, oh, she's happy. She's gonna be like celebrating something. I don't know. So I'm gonna do like a joyous pose. I'm gonna select all these spine controls, and I'm gonna kind of have her doing like a cheering pose. So I'm gonna go in, set keys on all of these. We're going to need to ease into that rotation on there. You'll notice that my wrist is kind of crumpling in here, and that's because that happens at a lot of elbows when you twist them a bit too far, is because there's not enough joints in there. Rapid Rig does come with a extra joint to ease that transition in here. It's this one right here. The only problem is that I've noticed that it's only parented to the wrist, but in reality it needs to be constrained to that and to the elbow if you want super nice deformation in there. I'm gonna have to adjust the skinning values on this though now in order to get it to a place that I really want. But I'll probably show that in like a different video, or maybe not. That's kind of a more detailed thing that we don't really need to worry about. But yeah. So now she's doing this happy pose, and mouth open. She's like, "Yay, did it! Cool." And there's a nice feature in Maya. So now we basically have two poses, one at 1 and then one at 12. And then I'm going to delete this. So now you'll see that she kind of slides into that position, right? And it's kind of it's all right, you know. But like animation's all about like this is when your 12 principles come into play, right? Because she needs to anticipate this move. She needs to have clean arcs. Notice how FK, our FK arm, rotates out. It's still not the best arc into that. Like I would want something that kind of, because you track it with your eye as it's going on here, it kind of goes, just sweeps out along this. I would want something that kind of goes inward and then like inward and out, like inward, up and out. You know, it's gonna kind of get that like joyous feel of like jumping up and joy. But you need to anticipate that. You need to time that out. But I'm just trying to show you guys pose to pose animating. So there's this feature if you have your key set up like this, where the entire body's on each keyframe. You can go into, where is it? Enable stepped preview. So that's going to go in, and if I play my animation now, it's only that last step, right? Or it's only those two keys. In reality, your keys are going are interpolating between each other, or in other words, blending between each other very smoothly. But if I disable that, now you'll see it's back to normal. And that's basically doing this. So it's called enable stepped preview, and that's talking about tangents, right? Wait a minute, let me turn off joints. I don't want any keys on joints. So that's talking about these values, and these keys right now have splines on them, right? And it's basically that Bezier curve from Photoshop. You'll see that I usually keep mine at auto, but the enable step preview is doing this. This is called stepped tangents, or step tangents. Boom. You see how that curve is no longer smoothly going throughout all the controls. It's just going, bop, it just cuts off at that last one. And you'll see now, even though I don't have enable step preview activated, it's still doing that step because we changed the actual values to be stepped. So I know people that like to work in stepped version first. I do too, depending on the scene, you know, because you can kind of focus on timing. You're like, okay, so I need. So if you're thinking about your acting of this, like I would want her to get to this. I might want like a little bit more anticipation. So I would need the anticipation pose between these. So I'm going to set that around. Yeah, let's do 5. Sure. Let me move this over. So anticipation for that. Her motion is going upwards, so she's going to be going down, right? She's going to kind of go down and Y a little bit. We're not going to get too far down here. I'm going to move this control back a little bit, and I'm going to set up this spine. I feel like when you're keying, it's always good, like when you're making a new pose, is to start with the hips, because the hips are going to, your hips, even when you're like doing like just regular tasks like standing, your hips are always constantly moving, just just a little bit, and but right now I start with the hips, then I go up the spine, and I'm trying to set these keys to set up a sort of like a spring motion. Like think of your spine as just a big spring. So if she's going up, she's gonna need to kind of anticipate down and then spring out of it into that pose. So if we're doing pose to pose, then I would want to have keys on all this stuff. So I just reaffirm. I'm going to get enable step preview just so I can see this. So you see that? I'm going to reduce my timeline so I can more easily just click around in this. So I have okay, so and then I'm gonna add some. I'm gonna adjust this last frame, this last key with all my controls selected. If you only had like half the controls selected and you moved it, and then you select your whole character, you'd see that like since you only had half the controls selected, half of them got displaced over here, and then the other half are still over there. So you need to be extremely mindful of what you're selecting and like what exactly you're keying around. So I'm going to adjust that there, and then I'm going to need an overshoot, right, to kind of exaggerate it. So I'm going to my overshoot pose is going to settle into this pose, right? So I'm just going to select this entire key and then copy and paste it right here. And the overshoot, I'm going to raise this spine up a little bit, or raise the root up a little bit. It's okay for her toe to leave the ground. You are going to have to adjust. So see how I'm hitting this lock on the knee? It's because this knee can no longer go any further. So you would need to compensate with this foot's animation instead. So if I go there to there, you see that the foot is raising up more naturalistically. Then you'd have to fix like exactly where that foot is touching on the ground, right? Maybe not so much for this class, but like if you want to be a big time animator, you got to pay attention to like all these tiny details in here, like where all that stuff's sitting. But this is just like, you know, intro tutorial for this. So for a more exaggerated pose, I'm gonna kind of get her a little bit higher in the air. I'm gonna raise up this shoulder as well. Right there. Oh man, she's so happy. And let's see if I can key this. Oh, look how happy she is. She's adorable. Oh, let's get these to align on the same. She almost looks a little bit like sad. Like she's putting on. Yeah, let's get these a little bit less. Right there, and then keep adjusting this, and this spine is going to be at its most extended pose. This foot finally makes sense, almost, even though it wasn't intended to be posed like that, but, you know, it's fine. Man, I'm going to have to go in and key these fingers. going to select all of them. I'm going to select all of them, then I'm going to deselect that mesh. In fact, I should just have that mesh not be selectable at all. And I'm just going to go into those rotations and just zero those out. And I'm going to delete these keys as well over here. Because you see how it was still in that original pose because it was auto-keyed onto that frame. I'm just going to delete that. Just in the entire key. So now we need to, like, kind of just looks like she's just kind of gyrating almost. So I want there to be more time on this first pose because it just doesn't really make sense visually. So I'm just going to straight up copy that key. And I just did that by right-clicking on that timeline copy. I'm going to paste. I'm going to go back to my graph editor, animation graph editor. And you'll see that I can now just go in and adjust it. So this key right here, which is this frame 5, is that anticipation key. Probably went a bit too much anticipation with the spine, but it's fine. I'm going to go in, select all of these, and because I want to give more time to this pose, right? So I'm going to go in and move over with shift and middle click with W to kind of just move those over. You'll notice that our keys on the timeline, like this one at 10, if I move it a little bit to the left, you'll see it's now at 8. If I move it one more up, it's at 9. So this is kind of what we have going on, you know. She's like, oh, yay, I'm so happy you bought stuff. So then I would probably add another key in here between these. And I would do that a few different ways. So I would turn off Enable Step Preview. You can see then. So with Enable Step Preview off, now you're just seeing your animation for what exactly it is. And you'll see that it's still pretty glitchy. Like it's just kind of gyrating around. So we need to, I'm just selecting all the keys. And I'm just going to move those to auto tangents. Because some of them were still stepped from when I showed you how to make them stepped before. So now there's still a lot of problems. Like this arm is crumpling in on itself. It hits this top pose and then doesn't settle very nicely into this. You're gonna need more time between these frames, right? Between 18 and 21, because it's too like like you can see it hitting those walls. It needs to be smooth throughout. I would probably even end up adding a jump to this, just to kind of push that, because Grandma, her silhouette is kind of small. So the more we can break that with our acting, the more, the easier it's going to read. So if we just added her like jumping in this frame somewhere, I would do that by moving like this. You know, you have to move those hips up at some point. But you see how like it's still super glitchy. Like you need to polish that for sure. But I would probably do that. But say if we wanted to go back into step mode, but we needed a key that was kind of between 11 and 18. Since we converted those keys into splines, you can see all of our nice splines in the graph editor. So if I just set a key right here, I have kind of like a rogue key out here in 15. I don't want that. I don't know what that is. So I'm going to delete that. And I have a key at 12 that I don't want either. I want to keep this graph as clean as possible in this early time. So if I just drag over to, because I had it like this at 14, if I drag my timeline over to 14 and then just press S, you'll see all of those controls appear to be keyed now in this section. So we can go in and go back to step preview now. you'll see that key is now in our step preview, which is pretty important because we need this, because this is basically the 2 points between these key poses at 18 and 11. And so we just need to make this work. We need to know where we want to kind of skew our arms in terms of timing. So I kind of want to bring this in. I want to bring this one in as well. Perfect, perfect, perfect. Bring this forward because she's kind of like getting a little bit inward, and then I want to curl all these fingers. Remember, you can do that with all of these. I'm just gonna do it like this. Normally I would go in on all the fingers and key them, but I just want to show you that. I just want to remind you that you do have these kind of cool controls as well. So if I do that, it just kind of makes a fist. But word of warning, I wouldn't do this in my own practice. I would go in and key all these fingers individually, because then that way you only have your keys on those fingers in one spot. I'm gonna also delete this thumb because this thumb like broke itself with that, so I'm gonna keep the thumb separately. And this is why I like animation, because it's only moving and posing. It's like the purest form of animation, in my opinion. Like, it's not experimental where you have to worry about some sort of clay being or something that you have to pose around in real world space. You don't have drawings, endless drawings that you have to do. It's just posing, timing, animation. You know, I would go in here. I'm just gonna go into form mode and see if I can select these easier this way. It's looking like it. Nice. Okay. To get these, I'm gonna only rotate on the Z. That way it doesn't look like any of my fingers are breaking. Right here. Right here. All right. So now, yeah, so you can see it's coming along. So this is pose to pose animation. Like, I set up my end pose, I set up like my breakdowns then, and then anticipation poses. Like, you kind of just, it's easier to think through your principles that way, you know. And some people might prefer animating straight forward or straight ahead. It's definitely a personal preference, but I pose to pose just makes a lot of sense to me, because you just know exactly where everything's going. Like, you know where you want to end up in the scene. It also helps when you set up your camera shots to be like, I know the camera needs to move this way. Like, it's basically, think about storyboards. Like, each pose would be just a new board. And once you get your poses in, then you disable step preview, and then you need to make this look good. And you do that by just going into each control and figuring out where it needs to end up. And yeah, so the rest of the class is pretty much just me animating from this point out. And yeah, so this is just a lot of tools that we have. IK, FK. We went over a lot of stuff. We went over some graph editor stuff. We went over auto key, which is super important in like setting and deleting and moving around keys. I know it wasn't the most organized kind of thing, but I find animation isn't the most organized process either. It's very organic. You kind of figure out what is going to happen as your scene goes along. And sometimes you might run into a problem where, say you're keying, like if you want to do like a 360 or something cool like that. Then you set a key right there. Now you'll notice that your other keys on your graph got kind of whacked. Like it was like zoomed in right here, and they were going off the graph. And you can always focus with F to to bring them into view. But you'll see that now her animation is messed up. That's just because it has to do with tracking rotations in only 3 values. Like we only have X, Y, and Z. Basically, you need 4 values to completely track animation. Otherwise, it's going to do it's going to hit something called gimbal lock, where it's going to gimbal out, where it's doing this kind of weird thing. So that means that one of those values went past what it's really hard to explain, but like one of those values went past something that our 3 value rotations can track. Normally you'd get around this by using something called quaternions, which is basically 4 values to track rotations in 3D space. And but you'll notice that our graph's kind of messed up. Sometimes you can go in and select and do curves Euler filter, and that seemed to have not worked. So you can go in and you can kind of just bring these down to where their past value was, because we remember if we're doing a rotation like this, we're using this yellow one, or in other words, rotate Y. So we know that our Y value has to be somewhere that we want it to be. So if these X and Z, the X and Z values are what's throwing it off. So if we go right here, in order to get the pose that we want, we could then drag only our Y key. That is if Euler doesn't work like it just did. So a lot of the times it does work. I'm not exactly sure what is going on behind the scenes that causes it not to work sometimes. But so if we wanted her to do a 360, then we'd have to drag it down there and drag that next key down there. If we didn't drag that, you'd see she does the 360, but then does does the reverse as well. So so yeah, there we go. Boom. And yeah, if you really wanted to do a 360, you're gonna need a lot more time on that. But yeah, so that's pretty much it for these animation this animation tutorial. Yeah, it takes a lot of work, guys. Even though it is in 3D, it's still going to take time, just like regular animation would. But yeah, hope you enjoy it. Feel free to email me questions if you have any. Yeah, see you later.